Welcome to this episode of Grassroots Advocacy. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. For those of you that are returning, I'm very thankful. I hope that you're finding these episodes very helpful and you're applying them so that you're able to be the best advocate you can possibly be. So up to this point in our discussions, we've talked about advocating for your profession in terms of talking to those folks who haven't yet made the choice to join the profession of certified nursing assistant. We also have talked about advocating for your profession as it relates to talking with your fellow nursing assistants, your fellow caregivers. In this episode, we're going to focus on communicating with traditional leaders. Those traditional leaders are the licensed and registered nurses, the department heads, the executive directors or administrators, those kinds of folks. And so one of the things that I'd like to share with you is that there seems to be, based on what the research is telling us, there seems to be a disconnect between the first line of care, nursing assistants, certified nursing assistants, licensed nursing assistants in general, and the folks that are perceived as being above them in the chain of command. For example, my interview shared data that really indicated that there was a significant disconnect between nursing assistants and the licensed and registered staff. And that is really important for us to understand, because once we understand the challenge in front of us, then we can come up with reasonable solutions and strategies to overcome that challenge. Another piece of this puzzle that I think is really important is how we approach our communications processes, how we get our point across. Some of us might be tempted to be part of the BMW club, and I'm not talking about the British motor wagon. I'm talking about blaming, moaning, and whining. It's something we do out in the break area, unfortunately, far too frequently. For today's episode, what I'd like to do is provide you some tips that may help you to achieve greater communication with your traditional leaders and thereby enhance your power as an advocate for quality of life, an advocate for quality of care, and an advocate for your profession. So let's first look at the first tip, which is timing matters. One of the things that's really true about the post-acute and long-term care environment, and in fact, the much larger healthcare continuum, is that everybody is busy. There are very few days when we have time to just sit around and twiddle our thumbs or chit-chat or things of that nature, because there are so many tasks, so many activities that are before us. This is especially true for your traditional leaders. For example, your charge nurse has, in addition to providing treatments and medications and things of those natures, he also has a responsibility for charting. They have a responsibility for communicating with the physician's office to gain orders and things. I mean, there's just a wealth of things that they are doing. And then with the executive director or the administrator, she or he may very well find themselves going from meeting to meeting to meeting with only a few moments to be able to stop and take a breath and collect their thoughts and organize their efforts. So as a nursing assistant, as a frontline caregiver, one of the things I'd encourage you to think about is your timing matters. It makes a difference. So for example, when you're thinking about whatever your issue is or whatever your concern is, or whatever it is that's the basis for your communication, ask yourself, is it something that cannot wait? For example, if you were in delivering care and you noticed a significant change in physical status with a person that you're caring for, that's something that requires immediate action. Would you agree with me? However, if you're in the break room and you hear Negative Ned or Negative Nancy beating their gums, and you know that at the source of that is something that's important to share. Does that require immediate response, or could that wait a little bit? So one of the things I'd ask you to do is look at the importance of the issue to decide whether it's something that has to be communicated right now or whether it's something that could be communicated at a later time. The second thing I'd ask you to think about is keeping your communication tight. And what I mean by that is getting in there, saying what you have to say, doing it in a focused way, and giving them the opportunity to have a time to respond, but doing it in such a way that you get your point across. So for example, let's say for the sake of discussion that you reported to a licensed or registered person that Mr. Omar had a change in status. And let's say that further, for the sake of discussion, that person said, "Oh, okay, I got it." And they wrote it down and they rolled their eyes and they went on their way. And a few days later, you went back and you said to that person, "Hey, what action did we take with Mr. Omar?" And let's say that no action really was taken. As a nursing assistant, as a first-line caregiver, it would be appropriate for you to go to your director of nursing services or director of clinical services or your executive director and say, "Hey, I need a moment to visit with you." I had an experience the other day that really is very frustrating and very disappointing. You see, I shared with Nurse X that Mr. Omar had a change in status that I observed while I was delivering care. When folks don't act on what I'm communicating on or what I'm telling them, it makes me feel like my opinion doesn't matter. And more importantly, in this particular instance, the needs of one of the men or women that we serve was not met. What action should we take as a team to improve this? You see, I've expressed my point of view in a very tight and concise manner, and I've been very clear. I haven't elaborated. I haven't said she's lazy or he's this or he's that. I just simply expressed my point of view and now I'm giving the leader an opportunity to think about it and provide some feedback. The next thing that I'd encourage you to do is to define or describe your desired outcome. So for example, let's go back to the nurse for a second. You could go to the nurse and say, "Hey, Betty, I noticed while I was providing care for Mr. Omar that he's had a change in physical status. He is no longer ambulating independently. What would be really cool is if we took steps to address this sooner as opposed to later, because we don't want him to have a substantial decline." You see, I've identified what that desired outcome is, which is we take action now so that we don't have a decline. So I'd encourage you to think about when you go in to talk with your leaders at whichever level it may be, have it clear in your mind what the outcome should be, what the result should be, what action you're hoping for them to take. And then the next point is then to really ask them to take action. So in the example of with the nurse, you could say, please do an assessment, or please call the doctor's office, or please talk to PT, physical therapy or occupational therapy, and get them to look at Mr. Omar. So that's a very specific ask. What is your ask? And so you want to be very specific about that. With your leaders, like earlier in the example, when I said you were speaking with your executive director, your DNS, your ask would be, help me figure out how we can improve communication and follow-up within our organization. And then the final tip for improving communication and being a great advocate is doing the follow-up. I've heard a number of our members say over time, "Man, I go and I tell them this or I tell them that and nothing ever happens. And it really drives me crazy." And we might be tempted to look at that situation and say, they really don't care. about what I have to say, or they're not really listening to me. That may not necessarily be the reality, though. Maybe they have just gotten so busy that they have forgotten that they needed to circle back with you to let you know what the resolution or the action was that they took. It's also important, I think, to ask you to think about this. Sometimes when we bring things to our leaders' attention, it requires a personnel action. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, that you and I are working on the hall or working on the unit, and you notice that I'm constantly walking by call lights and not answering them. Or you notice that I'm hoarding all of the washcloths. I go to the clean utility room, get a whole stack of washcloths and hide them under on my cart so nobody else sees them. So I get mine and forget about you. So let's say that I'm doing that, and you bring that concern to our traditional leaders, the licensed registered staff, the DNS, the executive director. You bring that concern to them. It's important to realize that when we bring those kinds of human resource concerns to our leaders, they may not always come back and give us, oh, hey, I sat down and I had a conversation with Jeff and he promised that he wouldn't do it again. And part of the reason for that is employees, we all of us have a right to an expectation of some degree of privacy. So one of the things you might do is you might look to see if I stop hoarding all of the washcloths, or if I start answering the call lights. That might be a way that you can know that that leader took action. Another way that you can follow up is you can go back to that leader and say, a week ago, you and I were chatting and I shared with you my concern about Jeff's performance. Have you taken action on that? And that would give the leader an opportunity to say, well, yes, we've had a conversation. That's something they could share with you and it would be okay. Or in the example of Mr. Omar, you could go to the nurse and you could say, hey, I've noticed that Mr. Omar's still having some challenges. Have we had a chance to do the assessment? Have we had a chance to reach out to the physician? Have we gotten a consult from PT or OT? So sometimes we have to take the bull by the horns, in a manner of speaking, and we have to reach out to those leaders to do the follow-up. We can't expect them to always come back to us with the answer or with the action. So I would encourage you, as you're advocating for your profession, as you're advocating for the men and women that you care for, as you're advocating for your peers, I'd encourage you to follow these steps. Go through this process, and I'm confident that doing so will create greater success for you and for your profession and for your organization. So to wind up our conversation for the day, I'd like to share a quote that comes from a great guy called Plato. And he said, "A wise man speaks because he has something to say. A fool speaks because they have to say something." I look forward to the next episode when we will continue our discussion on how to communicate with your traditional leaders as it relates to as a function of advocacy. I'll see you then.